Okay, I guess we're good to start. So in the last session, we covered all kinds of discovery techniques, different ways to profile a host, and basically find more information about your target. This session is the fun part, which means we're actually going to own a bunch of stuff and talk about once you own stuff, where you can go from there and what you can do with it. So to start off with, so in most pen tests, you start off from the external side. You don't have access to internal network. Your scope is limited to the IP addresses and the information that are visible from the internet. So this is often called, the crunchy candy shell, just because it's a hard layer. You can't really get much information out of it. Once you do, it cracks and you're in. So at this point, the only thing you can really touch are exposed hosts and services, VPN services that may be offered, and client-initiated sessions. And that's one thing that most people actually don't think about when you're doing a pen test is at any given point on a corporate network, there's actually a lot of outbound connections coming from the inside server back out. And depending on what type of client it is, what protocol it uses, there's things you can do to actually influence those sessions and send data back in. A good example of that is any UDP-based service, for the most part, goes from inside, going through a NAT gateway back out again, will actually create a mapping of UDP service on the external side back into that client source port. We'll talk a little bit more about an example application of that, but keep in mind that those types of established connections can be influenced, can be poked at from external attackers. So first off, this is basically old hat stuff, but it's something to keep in mind. Has anyone here actually used the FXP protocol, like way back in before 2000? Awesome, great, all right. So FXP was awesome, because what FXP does is you took one FTP server and you kicked another FTP server, and using the port and passive commands, you made them transfer data directly to each other. So instead of you actually having to download the files from one server on your little 28K dial-up, and going to another server uploading your 500 meg movie file to that server, since you're a Where's courier when you're doing this. Thanks, guys. So all the Where's couriers use this because they can transfer files from two fast sites directly, and the way that worked is FTP has a control channel and a data channel. The data channel is defined by either the port command or the passive command. That basically just says, this port's opened up, connect here and send your data. So over the last few years, most of the FTP servers out there have restricted it so FXP won't work. They do that by checking the source address and making sure the source address of the connection to the data port matches the source address of the control channel. And a few of them don't still, and those are lots of fun, but we'll talk about the case of the opposite of that, where during active FTP, which is where the client actually opens up the source port and the server connects back to that source port, not a single client I know of actually checked to make sure the source address connecting back into its data port is the same as the server it's talking to. So keep that in mind. If you're attacking an FTP client behind a firewall that has support for active FTP, which is kind of a stretch in some cases, if you can find that data port externally, connect to it and send data, the client won't know the difference. You can replace the files they're downloading with your own. So how to find those depends on the firewall in use, but basically you can just keep sweeping certain port ranges trying to find open ports. And you can even force an active FTP connection in some cases by forcing people to go browse from an FTP URL, things like that, via the browser. So you can combine a client-side attack that forces them to do an FTP outbound connection with this technique to basically bust back in to get their FTP source port. So you can basically send them to an FTP URL of a trusted site and then replace the data they think they're downloading from that site because you're already trying to connect to the port the second it opens up. So that's one side of it. Another sort of well-known technique is if you have a NAT gateway that looks for people doing active transfers, it'll look for the port command being sent across and NAT ports on the firewall. And there's tons of different techniques you can use to basically force the client to echo data back out that makes it look like it's setting up a connection and basically just pop a hole straight through the firewall to whatever internal host you want. So that's a fun trick too, but it's already been covered to death. I'm not going to go over it. So finally, passive FTP transfers. If you can find a host and that host allows anonymous access and the data ports that it allocates for transferring data is sequential, then you can basically brute force the ports above that and hijack the data ports before another client can get to it. And as we mentioned a minute ago, most FTP servers prevent you from actually replacing the data. In other words, when you connect to that port that you guessed, they just disconnect you. Well, so what? You still broke the client's transfer. They still can't do their backups. So a good indication of, let's say you're polling the server via IP ID from that previous slide with a graph on it, and you say, okay, they're doing FTP transfers. And you realize, hey, they're doing an FTP backup to this other server. If that server allows anonymous access and you can sample the port command results, you can actually use that to basically break their transfers, prevent their backup from happening. So these aren't meant to be kind of like earth-shattering attacks, just things to think about when you're doing a pen test, is how these protocols work, how you can influence it. And even in the case where you can't directly control the data channel, you can still prevent them from doing something that may be a business-critical operation. And the exploit for that is called passive ag, for passive aggression, because it breaks the passive command, basically. And you can still find that online. Just Google for it, or it's on metasploit.com, users, HDM, tools. So a little bit. Web servers are still lots of fun. I'm not going to go through all the different web application attacks out there because people beat the stuff to death. But definitely brute force your vhost, definitely brute force your files and directories. You find the best stuff this way. For about 3 years, Cray.com had a directory called /old on their web server. And whatever you did to GET request gave you an index listing. And in that index listing was a file called backup.tar that was 5 gigs wide, long. And if you download that file, it included all of Cray.com's web server. It was awesome. So, and they did it every night. So you can see the mod time has changed. It's like, wow, if I ever want to be disaster recovery for Cray, I am now that person. They finally actually changed the directory permissions, so that's the reason it's mentioned here is they finally fixed it. They don't let you see the directory listing anymore, and they changed the file from backup to something else. So if you can find the actual real file name again, you can probably keep doing it, but I couldn't find it offhand. Another thing you should look for, especially doing pen tests, is whether people leave source control files in the web root. A lot of folks will do SVN checkout and just take that data and stick it directly in the web root, especially if they have an internal source repo where they keep their web applications, like good developers, they keep it all in a repository. What a lot of people forget to do, though, is delete those. Instead of doing SVN checkout, they should be doing SVN export, which will actually, or CVS export. That'll remove those CVS directories, .svn directories. The example on here is, kind of stupid, just some random guy's website that I happened to find this morning that had this issue. But a couple pretty high-profile sites had this issue for the last few years, and they finally fixed it. A good example is freshmeat.net. So freshmeat.net, which is a lot of people's favorite sites for open source applications, you just went to /CVS/root. You get the CVS root for where Scoop stores all his files. So it's actually an SSH URL with some random host. So if you ever want to attack that organization, you can find out where their development tree is stored that way. Another example of that was eBay. So for a while, eBay.com actually had CVS entries available for most of their web hosts. It was pretty damn funny. So they finally fixed that about a year ago, but it was lots of fun to go through their images directories and find all the stuff they had in there, and it's fun to poke around. So 2 other quick hacks, and then we're going to get into some stuff that Valsmith is going to talk about. If anyone's using Apache as a reverse proxy, and you want to figure out whether they are doing that, the easiest way to do that is just put a %00 in your GET request. That'll actually break Apache's request parser, and the Apache reverse proxy between you and the real server will spit out an error and a version number in a lot of cases if it's got the tag set. So this is an example of basically being able to find out if a reverse proxy is in place. And if it's in place, now you know you can do those cool IPS evasion techniques, like doing like OXOB, OXOC instead of spaces between your method and your URI. Because what will happen is the Apache reverse proxy will strip those off, think it's white space, and then resend the request with those being real white space back to the vulnerable IIS server or whatnot. So that's a way to bypass use Apache-style evasion techniques against a non-Apache server after you footprint it through this first technique. Is anyone here familiar with Apache Dynamic Virtual Hosting? All right, well, it's kind of obscure, but I see a lot of really large web hosts doing it. How this works is instead of defining a different virtual host for every single host in your Apache configuration file, all you do is say Apache Dynamic Virtual Hosting, use this directory as the base. Here's the options that apply to all these users, done. And what that does is whenever host name comes in, Apache will look at that host name, map it to a local file system in the directory, try to find a subdirectory matching that virtual host name, and if it exists, it'll serve it up as a virtual host. So it saves you a whole lot of time as an admin because you don't have to go through and do all this work. The downside, though, is if the web server is configured in the global configuration file to have plus indexes on, so index, directory listings indexes, and they have dynamic virtual hosting, there's a neat bug where if you set the host name to be %00/, it actually triggers a bug where Apache will give you the entire directory listing of all the virtual hosts, because it serves up the directory below the virtual host directory. It serves you up all of those. So this is a quick hack. If you're attacking an ISP and you want to figure out which virtual host they have, this is one easy way to leak that. And this is the first place it's ever been presented, so hopefully they won't fix it for a while.
Yeah, %00 is magic. It just breaks all kinds of stuff. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about load balancing. You can use, in some cases, load balancing to cause networks to leak information that they hadn't intended to give you. For example, internal IP addresses. One way to do this is to use a TCP half-close request. There's a product out there called the Alteon ACE Director, which is a web load balancing system. And it's a good example of this problem. So this particular product mishandles the TCP half-open or half-close requests. There's 2 things you can do with this behavior. One, you can use it as a signature to say, okay, well, these guys are running this particular load balancing software. The other thing that you can do with this is get the load balancer to tell you the IP addresses of the internal network because they get forwarded back to the client. So, look for load balancing systems. Do your best to fingerprint them. This is sort of an obscure type attack, but it can give you some good information on the network.
Kind of a lesser known attack, but something you may see is any case where you've got a web application with a long-lived session going through a load balancer. A lot of times, if you just keep your session open long enough, the load balancer will screw up under high load and give you someone else's session. An example of that is if you run ASP.NET, and this is actually a bug with ASP.NET 1.1. Hopefully it's been fixed by now, but keep an eye out for it if it hasn't. If you have what's called sliding sessions enabled in ASP.NET, and you have basically, that says anytime your session cookie expires, automatically renew it. I had a client that, they're actually a bank, they went through and their customers, after 20 minutes of being logged in, would all of a sudden be staring at someone else's bank account information. It gave them the wrong session. So a bug in the lookup table is actually giving someone else's ASP session when the session expired. So when you're doing tests against a web application, like you may be in a hurry and really want to get a test, you really want to just bust a shell on it, but go ahead and write something in the background to do it while you're doing your other work that basically just keeps the request open for 20 minutes, keeps doing a request with it, and see if anything changes. Because there's a lot of bugs, just the longevity bugs, where things actually change over time. So keep an eye out for those because I know they're not much fun because you have to sit there and wait for it, but at the same time, they can actually leak some really cool details.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about attacking web systems. One thing that's common on sites that host a large number of virtual hosts or other types of web directories is that they tend to have lots of CGI issues, especially if they let their customers write their own CGI scripts. And this isn't necessarily anything new, but this sort of shows you the mindset that leads you to a whole bunch of machines compromised. So in this particular one, we were going after a system that had thousands of hosts. Some were actual, target.com, some were thecompany.com/whatever. Inside all these different virtual hosts were CGI directories with a bunch of scripts, some user-written, some downloaded, some commercially purchased. In this particular case, they had one script that we found a directory traversal bug. This didn't really get us much, right? It didn't get us a shell, but it let us poke around the web server. After a while, we determined that all the CGI directories were executable and writable by the web server, which is good news for us. And it's actually pretty common on web hosts. So using this directory traversal bug, it turns out that we can enumerate things like usernames, directories on the server, backup files, sort of like what HD was talking about earlier, and all kinds of information that helps us get closer to getting a shell on the system. It turns out that this particular target happened to be running Solaris. The nice thing about Solaris is that it treats directories as files when under certain conditions. For example, if you cat a directory name, it'll come back as if you had done an ls in that directory name. So using this directory traversal, you can sort of map out the directory structure of every directory that the web server user account has access to. This is great because it shows you, let's say you don't know all the virtual hosts, you should know there's a bunch. The directory structure may be something like http/website/vhost1, vhost2, vhost3. And you can really map out what all the different hosts to attack are. So using this directory traversal, we were able to find script names to a whole bunch of CGIs, stuff out there like if you ever heard of web hints or various CGI scripts that are vulnerable. So this is, I don't want to call it vulnerability scanning, but in a way it is. It's traversing directories to look for vulnerabilities that you can use. And on this large web host that had thousands of websites on it, we were able to find a couple hundred different ways of getting in. So this is an example of sort of a set of layered configuration issues that leads to a variety of compromises without actually having to use a lot of exploits. It's just misconfigurations of the server, leveraging what I call features of Solaris.
So keep it in mind, any vulnerability that you find that allows you to basically read an arbitrary file from a web directory on a Solaris system also allows you to get a directory listing of that directory. So if the folks who don't know that, it's kind of a cool trick and also lets you tell, yes, this actually is a Solaris box. So if you don't know about it, if you do know about it, great, but if you don't, it's a cool trick to keep in your back pocket.
Yeah, another good point to that is if you happen to be able to write to Solaris or like create a directory, but you can't create files, Solaris may treat the directory that you create as a file. So you create your file name as a directory, and then under that you make more directories, but those are actually like commands inside the file.
It's a good example. You could probably actually build out an entire PHP script just by doing make directory and then making directories below that. So the reason Vala brings that up is he actually has a really awesome bug he can't talk about. And he didn't tell me I can't talk about it. But basically the bug is there's a Solaris service that allows you to create arbitrary directories unauthenticated in Solaris like 10 and 11, I think. So yeah, anyways, he can't talk about that. But using that and basically putting those into a web directory, you can execute PHP code using these techniques. So that's where this stuff is going, but yeah, him. So anyways, so onto the DNS servers. So you're attacking DNS servers, the first thing you want to do is basically brute force host names. Try to figure out what internal names are mapped. Try to figure out what host names are mapped, like vpn.admin.hr. The same things you normally look for virtual hosting, but also apply to the host names. Something to keep in mind is when you see something like a server called Zeus, go ahead and brute force the whole damn, pantheon as well, because people tend to follow similar naming naming conventions. Same thing if you see something called, Neptune, look for, Saturn, look for Mars, things like that. Pretty basic stuff. So one thing you can do, if you can force the remote side to do DNS lookups for you or do DNS lookups against your system, is do like transaction ID analysis. And what transaction IDs allow you to do is basically, if you can predict them, if you can predict the source port and the transaction ID, you can cause a spoofed entry to end up in the DNS cache. And that's a great, beautiful thing for so many reasons. So we won't talk about why that's important. Hopefully you know. But sending everyone who goes to the internet site to goatse is a good reason why that would be fun. So, for example, with Bind9, it had an issue with birthday attacks, which basically means there's only 65K possible transaction IDs. If you know the source port, it's pretty easy. So you just keep brute forcing by sending so many responses back that eventually you manage to get one to hit. And at that point, you spoof the cache. A recent vulnerability has been the PRNG that Bind9 uses to generate transaction IDs has been shown to be flawed, and you can predict the whole damn thing. So you don't even have to do a birthday attack. You can just figure out where you are on the PRNG chain and do that, and figure out, okay, well the next XID based on this chain is going to be this. Return that response, and now spoof any host name you want into the cache. And there's actually a whole, all the proof of concept code was posted for this. We didn't do it. I'm just saying you should look at the stuff because it's a really cool new attack. Finally, there's a product called VxWorks. Has anyone heard of it? Great, okay. So VxWorks is actually used under the shell of tons and tons of little appliances, little firewalls, little NAT devices, all kinds of crap. Unfortunately, every device that my company and my coworkers have looked at that runs VxWorks has a really shoddy DNS client. We've reported a bunch of bugs specifically to the vendors to base their products on VxWorks, but not to VxWorks themselves. And the reason for that is, well, VxWorks isn't that interesting, but the products that are based on it are. So in this case, we found an issue where the VxWorks, if you do a DNS lookup from inside VxWorks, the source port and the transaction ID are completely predictable. They just increment. So it starts off at like 1023, and then goes to 1024, 1025 for the source port, and the XID just starts off at 1. So, and then wraps back. So if you can ever get one of these devices to do DNS lookups and want to basically spoof a cache entry into a VxWorks device, it's completely freaking trivial. You don't even have to try. So if you see a firewall or NAT device or VPN based on this product, it's flawed if they do any kind of DNS lookups using the native VxWorks resolver code. And finally, one extra technique that I found works once in a while, and I don't know whether this is just the F5 server I tested or it's common configuration. It just happened in the wild, so it's hard to really pinpoint what software is in use, is when I force the client to look up a host name under my fake subdomain, I returned an A record, but I also returned another A record for their own host, and it ended up overriding their own entry. So just by returning extra responses to some DNS servers, you can actually override existing entries in the table. And it was probably a non-standard server, but definitely keep that in mind if you're doing a DNS server attack or an audit based on a DNS server. All right, so this is where we start to get to the fun stuff. One of my favorite things in the whole world is SMB. SMB being the server message block, aka kind of the NetBIOS transport, kind of the thing that makes like Windows boxes talk to each other for the most part. It's what Samba uses. It's what almost all the RPC APIs inside Windows actually get transported over SMB or directly over DCRPC. So it's all kinds of fun stuff. And if you can get one of these SMB clients to talk to your server, you can play hell with it. You can do all kinds of great things. So the first thing you can do is if you can force them to connect to your server and try to access a share name or an image, you can just steal their hash. And by stealing their hash, I don't mean the raw landman hash. I mean the hash which is the raw landman hash encrypted with a challenge key you provide them. So that's the way it works. You give them a challenge key, they encrypt their hash against the challenge key, send that to you. If you create a static challenge key, and a friend of mine who's actually here at the conference today has a rainbow table where you basically hard code the challenge key and do all the permutations and build up about 300 gigs worth of data, and then you can do lookups on it. You can basically break the original password just based on this hash password as well. So you can do rainbow cracks against this as well as just a standard layman lookup. So you don't even need the cracked hash password. You can just use this password as long as you hard code the challenge key in your rainbow table as well. So one of the best things about NCLM is how it's standard. It's the same NCLM authentication on your IIS web server that accepts IIS, negotiate, NCLM, authenticate, whatnot in your HTTP header. It's the same authentication that IIS accepts by default that your mail server, your Exchange server uses for authentication. Same thing that your POP3 service uses, that your IMAP server uses, that your SMB server uses. So if you can get one of those protocols to come into your system and someone to authenticate with that protocol, you can turn around and pipe that protocol straight back to another host on some other protocol entirely. So for instance, is anyone here familiar with SMB relay attacks or SMB relay 2? All right, well this should be new stuff, and it's been around since like 2001 or even earlier than that, but it's really useful stuff and still applies to the latest versions of Windows and whatnot. Basically, if you set up a fake SMB server and you convince someone to browse your share, just do / your IP address on a local subnet. When they connect to you, you connect back out to their external mail server, you connect back out to some other server that they can normally authenticate to, and you ask that server for the challenge key. You say, please, give me your 8-byte challenge key. It says, okay, it gives you a challenge key. You turn around and you give that back to the client. The client will see that challenge key, and if you do it right, you can force them to authenticate thinking they're talking to their own system or talking to a real system, and they'll automatically authenticate against that challenge key. They'll encrypt their password to get the hash, then they'll take that hash and encrypt that hash against the challenge key. You pass it off to the real server. And then you kick the client to the curb and take over the session. Be like, all right, thanks, Bob. I got your email now. So that's one way. If you allow outbound SMB connections from your internal network to the internet, and a whole lot of ISPs all of a sudden stopped blocking it in the last 2 months. It was great. So Time Warner in Texas no longer blocks outbound 139 445. So if you spam a whole bunch of Roadrunner users and say, hey, here's this really cool email, and in the image source you do / the IP address of your external mail server, external SMB server, /share, /that, and in return you pipe all that back out to Roadrunner's mail gateway, Roadrunner's web interface, which accepts NCLM authentication as part of the authentication process. You can basically take over their email accounts. And granted, anyone who uses Roadrunner email, you probably aren't that interested in their email account. But we're going to go into more of this stuff later. So that's the basic idea, is that you can accept authentication from one protocol, from one user, and turn around and either apply it directly back to them or apply it to an external service and just use that to bust a shell or get access and so on. And we'll go into a really cool demo of that a little bit later. So finally, social engineering, which we didn't really want to talk about this that much because people say, oh, it's just another social engineering talk, but don't forget about this stuff. It's so easy, there's not really much point in not talking about it. Print out a couple CDs, put free version of Office on top, make it look like something commercial that's free and pass it out to people going into a building. I mean, people just take it and plug it in. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's still really effective, and make sure you don't forget it as part of your testing. If you want to go beyond CD-ROMs, because CD-ROMs, people realize, oh, these things might be dangerous, let's not use them. You can actually just take those USB keys, like the U3 Autorun, which I don't like the U3s because they're hard to actually hack. But I do like those, the UDRWs, which you can get from Hagiwara, which I probably pronounced terribly wrong. But those devices, they give you a whole SDK for it. You can develop it. You can build your own Autorun tools. And I built a whole lot of them. And you can walk up to, let's say, Target, where there's a little employment kiosk where you can sit down to become a Target worker. So they actually have USB keyboards. And the keyboards accept more than just the USB slots take more than just keyboards. So unplug the keyboard slot, plug in your Autorun, and you just launch your worm on the Target network if you wanted to go about doing those things, which I don't endorse. So next up, so if you're like a big balla and you got like lots of money and you really want to break into a network or you're getting paid like a few $100,000 for a test, go out and buy a Nokia N800. Go buy an N770. Go buy a really cool little portable handheld computer, hold a fake sweepstakes, and send it to somebody saying, hey, you won this really cool handheld computer. And most of these devices just run Linux. So you just put your entire auto-owning toolkit on this little Nokia, send it to the CEO and say, hey, you won this cool device as part of your sweepstakes at this conference that you don't remember going to. And he goes, ooh, shiny, and starts playing with it. And the first thing he's going to do is plug into the network, set it up on Wi-Fi, and the second it does, you make it rip everything out of there, dump his passwords, and send it off to you. So if you got the money for it, which is only about a couple $100 now, Woot.com had a special on these for $200 each for N770s. It's a whole lot of fun. They're dirt cheap when it comes to the relative cost of doing a pen test. Finally, a really cool hack I saw, I think it was like Hackaday or Engadget, is someone took one of those UPS power bricks where it looks like a surge protector, but it's much fatter, uglier, and they opened it up, ripped the battery out, threw it away, put an Ethernet switch into it, placed a OpenWRT core, just basically ripped all the case off an OpenWRT, put a flash card on it, stuck it inside of it, put it on the Ethernet port, and they ran the Ethernet in one side, back out the other side, and so on. And they just basically put their own little evil server inside the UPS backup. Then they just threw it over their shoulder, walked into a building, said, oh, we're here to fix that UPS where it went bad, the one by the printer, swap it out, done. So really simple things, but if you think you're like, a cool hardware engineer and you want to like mess with this stuff, and you also do pen testing, definitely let the innovation continue. So those are really cool ways to own boxes, and they're lots of fun to make, and the clients will be like, who to what? You did what to my what? And lots of fun. So finally, we're on to the internal network, and I think I handed off to, no, almost. So internal network, this is kind of the soft, chewy part. Once you're inside, it's almost game over, and it's almost always game over. But we want to talk about some different things you can do once you're inside the network, or if you're inside of a really big network where they pretend like you have internal security. So first off, NetBIOS names. The name of a machine on the network as advertised by NetBIOS. Those things can be magic sometimes. For example, anyone know if you set your NetBIOS name to be WPAD, anyone know what that does? Excellent, right. So Internet Explorer has a built-in feature for proxy detection. And the way it figures out what proxy to use when that thing is checked, which it is by default, and it's still on about half the workstations I've seen on a corporate network, is when it first starts up and tries to browse the site, it looks up a name called WPAD. Now with Internet Explorer 6, there's actually a bug where it not only looked for a NetBIOS name called WPAD, it looked for WPAD.its own domain, like WPAD.mybank.com, and then it actually went ahead and looked up WPAD.com, and would try to use that as the WPAD.dat server. So if you want to get a kind of a belly laugh out of this, check out WPAD.com. There's some guy sitting there saying, why are you sending me a request? What did I do? So he finally figured it out. He's like, all right, so it must be these auto proxy stuff. And he put a little like helper page up there saying, okay, here's how you disable it. Stop hammering my damn server, people. But the funny thing is, if let's say, if you talk about domains you want to bid on, that's a domain I would love to own. But at that point, you own every single Internet Explorer user on the freaking planet will go through your own proxy server. And at that point, the games begin, right? So they finally fixed that Internet Explorer 6.0. And everyone rejoiced. It's like, finally, we're done with that. There's not some random internet host that controls what every client in my organization does now. And then with Internet Explorer 7, they broke it again. So welcome back to WPAD. Another magic name, which isn't that important, but if you have Computer Associates products in your network, is CA license. And this is the default license server used by CA products. If they connect to this, and this server receives a UDP packet on like 4325, it's some high port. We've got a bunch of exploits for it and Metasploit. But if you respond back with a whole bunch of crap, 90% of the time you just kill the server. And there's so many bugs in that damn thing, I got tired of auditing it. But basically, if you make your hostname CA license, you can cause hell as well. So this is where it gets interesting. If you run a Microsoft DNS server, and your DNS server is also your DHCP server, what happens is, anytime you specify a host name as your DHCP client, it gets registered in the local DNS too. So if you want to become the WPAD server for the entire network, you can either just do NetBIOS name, you run like NMBD, or just change your host name to be WPAD, or you can just run DHCPCD-HWPAD. And now the local DNS server will tell everyone, not just your local subnet, hey, this guy over here is a WPAD server. Everyone go over here and give him your shells. And that's what we're about to go cover. So this talk is about hijacking NTLM, or this part of the talk is about hijacking NTLM. The goal of this is to quickly own every local workstation. You can do variants of this attack to actually exploit external hosts, to do it against internal hosts connecting back out. There's a billion different ways to kind of permutate this. We're going to talk about the most common case, where you're already sitting down on the local network, or you already have control of DNS resolution for the client. Either you've got a, I'll go into details here in a second. But this is kind of just a new twist on SMB Relay, which is a tool that's been around since 2001. It's a really nice tool, and considering how much code it was like 80,000 lines or something like that, just obscene. Or 80K, so probably less the number of lines. But it was still painful. So yeah, we actually inputted almost everything in SMB Relay 2 into Metasploit now, and it's actually readable Ruby code. It's not this giant-ass C++ file that only compiles on Windows now. So the first step, you got to man-in-the-middle all outbound web traffic. There's lots of ways to do this. We talked about a couple of them, which is cache poisoning via bind9, via birthday or PRNG. You can specify WPAD via DHCP. You can specify WPAD via NetBIOS name. Lots of different ways you can basically make yourself a WPAD server. If you're lazy, you can do plain old ARP spoofing, call it done. And that's pretty straightforward. And then run transparent proxying and redirect it back to local service. Or you can just run a rogue Wi-Fi access point. And at that point, you use something like Karma to say, yeah, I'm WPAD, come through me, go through me. Or just relay all the connections going through your own host. So this is the first step. It's not that hard to do, and for the most part, you can do this with a billion different techniques. We won't go into it too much. Second step, this is actually optional. So if you're running against, if you're trying to target a browser that has a concept of the intranet zone being more secure than the internet zone, for example, IIS 6, some versions, I had to do this, I don't know why. The first thing you do, once you become the proxy, once you actually run this proxy or have control of their HTTP connection, is you redirect them back to a host called intranet or something with only one host name in it. And once you do that, then you can redirect them back to the next stage. But that gets around those zone restrictions of redirecting users to a UNC path from an internet host. So that's some security fix went in that blocked that, and this is the way back around it. And you can do WPAD plus a SOC server, which is what I'm about to demonstrate, or we can do SQUID transparent or just 302. Lots of ways to do it. So finally, this is how you actually get them to connect to your SMB server. The first example, which is every version of IE I know of, you just do image source, // IP, share, and anything. And they'll go ahead and connect and do the whole damn thing. It's pretty straightforward. And a lot of folks may have tried this before and had issues with it, and the tricks for it are actually making them think they're talking to their own client. And I'll talk about how that works in a bit. Basically, you say, yeah, I'm your own host name. Yep, I'm you. Please, tell me all about ourselves. And they do that. Firefox. So Firefox has a security model that says we aren't allowed to redirect users to UNC paths. It's a bad thing. We're going to disallow that. And they tried to. And then they failed miserably. And one thing they failed miserably at blocking was the Moz icon URL. This is also the alternate way to exploit the ANI vulnerability on Windows via Firefox. Is basically, it's a way to specify, give me the image that corresponds to the file with this extension, but it'll actually go through and pass this off to the file system later before it does that. So what happens here is you do Moz icon -URL : files // and that tells us to go to a UNC path. So it's kind of this weird kind of backdoor way to do it in Firefox that is patched in 2004. There's actually one way that isn't patched, but I can't talk about it, and that's going to get patched in 2005. So basically, Internet Explorer, Firefox, you're still screwed. You can still get redirected to a UNC path right now. If neither of these work for some reason, you can also embed UNC paths to all sorts of third-party applications. You can put them inside of PDFs. You can put them inside of Flash files and redirect them that way. You can put them into Windows Media files. Say, oh, the codec is stored on this UNC path. So you can embed these things everywhere. So the goal of all these different things we're doing, all we're really trying to do is get this user to connect to our SMB server. And the reason for that is now it gets fun. So as we said before, to exploit this, we accept the SMB connection coming in. We say, hey, I got a client. And then you figure out where you want to take that client. You only have one shot at this piece at least. So you say, what server do I want to have authentication credentials on? So at that point, you either target the PDC, you target another workstation you need to get access to, or you target their own system, which is by far the easiest way to do it, and what we're going to demo here. Once you've accepted the connection from the client, and you connect back to your target server, you ask the target server for the challenge key. And now you pass that challenge key back on to the connecting client. You let the client authenticate, and during that process, you do things like tell them your host name is their host name, and just echo things back to them so they feel comfortable and warm and fuzzy. And then you break their neck. So, and then you lose your microphone, apparently. Here you go. So yeah, you pet the bunny, pet the bunny, pet the bunny, and here's how we do it. So at this point, you've got an authenticated session to an SMB host, and you disconnect the original client, and you use the authenticated session to do something evil. If you have administrative access, like you as an administrator trying to browse the web via the browser, you basically just connect to admin $. You then use the service control manager. You connect to admin $. You take your shellcode, stick it into an executable, upload it to admin $, which has also become system root on Windows, and then you use the service control manager to create a new service and start that service using that file. So basically, this is exactly how PSExec works. And yes, there is now PSExec built into Metasploit. So you just use exploit Windows SMB PSExec, give it the username and password, and bam, you can run shellcode on a remote host with username and password now. The neat thing about the SMB stack and Metasploit is we don't actually need the real password. You can just give us the hash. So if you don't feel like cracking your hash before using it to run shellcode in someone's system, you don't have to. You can just use Meterpreter to one box, type hash dump or use PW dump to get the raw layman hash. And in the SMB parameters, we do SMB user and SMB pass. Just pass the whole damn hash in there as the password. We'll recognize that that's a hash and we'll recognize that that's a hash and go ahead and use that as part of the authentication. So now you can just use the dump to hash passwords from anything without even bothering to crack it and immediately go run shellcode in some other box using that hash. So to roll back on this stuff, okay, so at this point we've got PSExec. We can run whatever shellcode we want, and I may be completely full of crap. So now we're going to demo it to make sure I'm not. So the first thing we do is we have a Windows XP system over here that is fully patched. And if I had internet access, I could show, yes, there's no updates available for your system, and all hunky-dory over here. So our IP address is 172.16.233.130. If we open up Internet Explorer 7, the latest, most secure version of the web browser from Windows, Microsoft, it's actually the latest version, nothing fancy here. All I'm showing is we're not doing anything, there's no default setting that we're not setting, we're not changing anything. It's basically, this is how it works. So here we go, automatically detect settings, which is actually the default. I unchecked it from a previous demo, so ignore that piece. So automatically detect settings, close out, okay, not a big deal. Done. Alrighty, so first thing we want to do over here is set up our Samba version, which will tell everyone on the local subnet that our name is WPAD. The way we do that, and it's probably hard to read, but you can just listen to me if you can't see it, is we set, let's see, in your smb.conf file, there's a parameter called netBIOS name, and you just want to set that to WPAD. And then all you do is write nmbd, and you're done. So you're now the WPAD server. It's nmbd. Now to prove that works, we go back over here, and we just type WPAD. And it should do a DNS lookup, and it should do a local netBIOS name lookup, and there we go. It found out that .1 is now WPAD, because it did a host name lookup and all that. Kind of a weird bug with Windows, or I don't even know if it's a bug or not. You know how DNS has a transaction ID that is supposed to be kind of random and hard to guess? Well, NetBIOS name lookups also have a transaction ID, and it's sequential. So for whatever that's worth, you can actually spoof a NetBIOS response to somebody, which doesn't seem like it's really worth much, but if you ever need it, that's there too. So now we know that WPAD is now set up. So the next thing we want to do is start our web server. And our web server is going to host a single file called wpad.dat. And the cool thing about wpad.dat file is it's just a JavaScript function. It's a JavaScript function called find proxy for URL. And from here you determine based on the URL they specify what proxy server they should use. So we're going to be lazy and say for every single server out there, just go through 172.16.233.1, which is my IP address, on a port 1080. So straightforward, done. The cool thing about this technique is that this JavaScript will run even if they have JavaScript disabled. Doesn't matter. It's a little bit locked down, like you can't do certain operations from the side of it, at least with IE7, but you may be able to do some things that still allow you to pop normal IE vulnerabilities before they even get to a web page. All right, so this was a little bit tricky because Gentoo is trying to fight me on this. So Apache CTL start, get HTTP, localhost, wpad.dat. Basically saying, yeah, it actually returns the right URL. So yeah, my web server works. Yeah, it returns wpad.dat. So at this point, I'm running, my host name is set to be WPAD because of the NetBIOS name daemon. I'm running a web server that serves up wpad.dat, and that web server now says, now use this SOCKS proxy. So I have to go run the SOCKS proxy, and I'm lazy, and I don't like actually writing my own SOCKS servers or setting them up, so I just kind of stole a whole bunch of the Metasploit code to do it. So one of the cool options of MSF console is -r, which says, hey, just run all these commands in a row. And since I'm a lazy ass, I just did that. So first thing I did is take a little SOCKS proxy that was like 10 lines of code, and I'll open it up so you can see what it does. MSF3, modules. This isn't part of the main tree yet, but it will be soon. Modules, auxiliary, server, SOCKS. All right, so the font's really small, but the basic idea, and I'm going to try to scroll down here real quick so you can see it. We basically parse the SOCKS request, make sure we know what they're trying to do, and then at the very bottom, all we do is print out this little chunk of HTML saying, thank you for playing, welcome to Evil Proxy, and give an image tag to image source equal / our IP address again, and a share name. So all we're doing is, no matter what website they try to browse, when they use our proxy, we return the same web page that says, hey, load this image file from this SMB server. So pretty straightforward. So now what we're going to do is, and the second part of this exploit, you can see, the second part of the RC file, is we use an exploit called SMB relay. And then we set it to use shell reverse TCP. So give me a reverse connection. Then we set our L host. We then set our L ports and our exploit. That says what host and port to connect back on for a reverse shell. So pretty straightforward. All we do now is just run MSF console. And you have to do it as root because it has to bind on 139 for the fake SMB server. So sorry, but until we have some magic way to bind to low ports on Unix, you have to run this thing as root. So kick that up, and it may take a few seconds to load up all the modules, read its configuration file, get rolling, things like that. And here we have our SOCKS proxy spawned off in the background. We loaded our SMB relay exploit that also went in the background. We top jobs, we can see we've got two modules in the background, one that's a SOCKS proxy, one that's a relay. So we're just running both from inside Metasploit. To make sure they all work, first thing we do is going to telnet to our SOCKS proxy, make sure it's actually up. Yep, we got a SOCKS proxy, it's good. Now telnet to our local SMB server. Yep, it's good, we're all set. And at this point, all the client has done is open up the browser and make sure they've got auto detect proxy set up, and we just go browse the internet. And you go, da 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 da, I want to go see, I don't know. Microsoft's cool, we like them. So you wait a little bit. So what it's doing now is it resolves WPAD, realizes that it's my host, and then once it realizes that WPAD is my host, it grabs wpad.dat, parses the JavaScript function, runs that, says, okay, I have to use the SOCKS proxy at this address to get to that site, connects to that SOCKS proxy, says, I want to get to this site. And we say, okay, great, you're connected to it. Go ahead. And we give them an HTML web page that says, okay, now you need to load image source equals // etc. So it's kind of slow over here, probably because it's doing things over here. And, aw, come on. Maybe telnetting to the SOCKS proxy first and didn't make it happy. Yeah, most of this code is like a week old, so bear with it. We're going to just do it one more time. Work Thursday. And we're also going to sniff the local network to figure out what the hell it's doing in the background. And VNet 8. So there we go. So everything's up and running over here. We're not going to telnet to it in case that's what broke it last time. Let's see, make sure our WPAD server is still reachable. Yep. Open up Internet Explorer again. Options, verified all there. LAN settings, automatically detect. Yep, all good. And www, let's go to AOL now because Microsoft wasn't our friend. Look at the connections coming in. So we see WPAD.local domain requests. So I guess it's not going to look at WPAD on the local network until it can't find WPAD in its local domain. See some timed windows.com posts. Let's see, what are we doing? I don't know where the hell it's smoking. Let's see, .2. Now it's looking for an LDAP server. Oh, come on, you suck. It's trying to do a DNS lookup still. So we'll fake that real quick. Normally, if you're actually connected to the internet, this goes right away because it'll resolve it. Oh, there we go. Waiting for www.aol.com. So at this point, it finally gave up and tried to connect to it, connect to our SOCKS proxy, all that thing. Now, where's our damn shell? It still hasn't done the web request yet. That's annoying. Jason. Yeah, it's annoying. All right. Can't get out of the Microsoft loop. All right, we'll go ahead and set up a DNS server real quick just because it takes 2 seconds. It's hosts, all kinds of fun hosts in here. Let's call it 1.2.3.4 www.bob.com. DNS mask -i DMnet 8. There we go. And the one test case I didn't try is when we're not actually connected to the internet, whether this whole thing would work, because it wouldn't be able to do DNS lookups. That's annoying. All right, so if we want to be lazy and assume this thing actually did work, in the case of DNS resolution, the way this would actually work is you just go to a web page that has a UNC URL inside of it. So I'm going to disable the auto proxy stuff because that's just one way to basically get the connection, but it's not the only way. And now I'm going to go into the web root. create a new HTML file, basically just saying, go ahead and give me this image source equal / / 172.16.233.1, share name, and then bob.jpg, close it out, body, HTML. So pretty straightforward. Now we're in our web browser over here, we're just going to go straight to that IP address and straight to the URL, which is much less cool, but oh well, at least we got it working. Test.html. So go to test.html, it says waiting for. At this point, it's actually trying to do SMB connections to that UNC URL. And where's our sniffer? Oh, come on. Anyways, that's what happened for reverting my image before I test it. Let's see. I should be okay. I think the bug at this point is that I unchecked a setting that you normally don't have to worry about. Annoying. So Windows XP, by default, only allows you to authenticate as the guest user, even if you have a valid username and password. That changes when your box joins a domain. And so I configured the system to say, yes, you're joined to a domain. But apparently when I did a revert of the image, it brought me back to before I set the change. So annoying, but we'll get it. Worst case, I can just run this thing real quick, but that's kind of cheating. Where are we? There we go. Thanks. Policies. Options. Where is this thing? Up. Where is it? Down. All right, here we go. Yeah, local user authenticated as guest. This is what happens when you join a network. This top setting is set for you automatically. That way administrators can actually use your machine and so on. So hopefully Val won't kill me that I just ruined this by doing a revert before I did the test. But anyways, we're all set now. So we go back. You can ignore this crash. That's just new code. And we go to the website, and now we just refresh the site. And refresh this site. All right. Damn demos.
Demo goblins.
Yep. 172.16.233. H1, test.html. There we go. So we have a connection back. The first request you see doesn't have a password set. It's just saying, receive a connection from Windows 2002, Service Pack 2, which just means XPSP2. And, oh, right, sorry. One of the things, so Windows gets a little bit weird about network I/O. If you try to connect to a share on a host and it doesn't work, won't let you just try it again real quick. You have to actually give it a different share name. Otherwise, it caches the fact that it didn't work the first time and doesn't automatically retry real quick. So we just randomize the share name. That's actually randomized automatically in my code, so not a big deal. So there we go. Right up. Where's our hash? There we go, finally. It's only giving us guest. Why do you only give us guest? All right, screw this damn thing. You gotta restart the computer. That's freaking annoying. All right. We'll get it, damn it. All right, so while that restarts, I'll let Val get a little bit further into his talk so I don't keep embarrassing myself over here. But, yeah.
Yeah, if there's any MCSEs, we'd probably use some help.
Yeah.
Same thing happened to Bill Gates.
So before you get to your demos, let me know, and then we'll swap back and try it.
Okay. All right, just give me a second here to try to get it on both screens up there. Okay, good. All right. So we're going to talk about several different things, starting off with file servers. Network-attached storage systems are safe and secure. Don't worry, because the vendor doesn't really care. A lot of these types of systems have unpatched Samba daemons. They're basically providing shares to Windows boxes using SMB protocol, and they don't necessarily use the latest, greatest patched versions. So there's some examples of this. One of my favorites is OSX, and we'll go into some examples about that in a minute here. There's inconsistent file permissions for different protocols. Samba is awesome. 1999 called, and they want their bugs back. If you're really old school, you might remember the SMB null session problems where you could enumerate users, shares, policies, all kinds of stuff like that. Well, a lot of times on these types of systems, these little appliances that are running SMB, you can still do that stuff. So on a network, all the Windows clients may be patched, may be configured correctly, can't do anything. Look for the network storage appliances. Another good thing that I've seen is that you can actually brute force accounts because they don't do lockouts. So these are some old bugs coming back to haunt new boxes. One example is I was scanning a network looking for open port 139, SMB shares, things like that, and I found one that happened to be an OSX box. The really cool thing is that the user had sent out an email to a newsgroup saying, if everyone used OSX, they'd be totally secure, stupid Windows, blah, blah, blah. And yet they were exporting shares using SMB. On this particular network, the sysadmins actually did vulnerability scans with Nessus, things like that, and they had found, hey, look, you're vulnerable to these things. And the user would say, oh, that's a false positive. I'm running OSX. I'm not vulnerable. We said, okay, you're owned. So on this particular box, we just did the same old school stuff you might have seen before. We did a null session connection, and it accepted us. We used, there's a lot of tools for doing this. Enum is one I like a lot. We enumerated users and shares on this OSX box. They didn't have a lockout policy. There's no restrict anonymous type settings on these systems. So we actually started brute forcing several user accounts until we finally got some with weak passwords. We got a shell, escalated to root, and the user response was, but I'm running OSX. So the point being that just because the platform doesn't initially line up with the exploit that you think you're using, give it a try because a lot of systems are vulnerable to these problems.
So as a quick note about Samba versus Metasploit, we actually have a lot of these new Samba vulnerabilities with working exploits inside Metasploit now. So one of the cool things about the Linux exploit for that is we actually return to the vsyscall page. That's that page at oxffffff and your /proc pid maps. What that does allows us to actually have a universal return address for every version of Linux running Samba on x86 and IA32. So it's a really nice exploit, and in the cases where it doesn't work, such as like Ubuntu boxes, we just went ahead and added targets for them too, so they work as well. So those Ubuntu folks shouldn't feel left out. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm finding a lot of enterprise copiers are running over Samba as well.
Exactly. So this comment was that a lot of enterprise copiers run an old version of Samba. Many of those are actually Xerox machines running an old version of Solaris, and they use Samba to share out printers to everybody. For example, the Hiroshima newspaper company, right by the Peace Museum in Japan, which for some reason I know actually runs lots and lots of versions of Samba. So anyways, great example of they actually run their entire newspaper on a printer that's exploitable to 10-year-old Samba bugs. So yeah, you can use not only this bug, but trans to root, NT-trans, all those other vulnerabilities to exploit those systems. And we have support for Solaris for this one as well. So yes, you could exploit your printer with this bug.
Yeah, that's a good point. On pen tests, I've often used printers, copy machines, to either like stash my code on the machine to get around TCP wrappers or firewalls. There's all kinds of cool stuff, so don't forget about printers because they can help you get to the next level. Zombie hosts as well. You can use the printers as zombie hosts. Yeah, exactly.
All right, quick note. So the Rise security folks, these are the guys who worked on the original version of I worked on the kind of a proof of concept to get it working, and ended up working with these guys to getting the Talloc magic overwrite required to make this exploit reliable. So the folks at Rise Security have been working on this for the last 2 months. Like the really sharp guys, it's Raymond and Adriano, and they're not here today, but I told them I'd go ahead and give a shout out for them up here. And so what happened is Tipping Point released the Samba vulnerabilities, and everyone went ahead and started working on the exploits. We all had code working sort of for Linux early on, and then with their help, we got it working really, really well. And of course, I ran into a guy who had his exploit working 3 years ago, and he's like, yeah, damn it, that bug's fixed now. Oh well. So every box from the last 3 years is probably exploitable as well, but he didn't really tell anyone about it. So Tipping Point released advisory. People start working on code for it. Out of nowhere, Symantec released a paper saying, oh, you can exploit this in OSX, and there's no patch for it, and our researchers are able to actually get a remote reliable exploit and everything else. Like, Okay, great, Symantec, you got any code for that? And of course, no, because they don't release any code. So they had this great paper saying they can exploit it, but never really ponied up and said what they could do with it. So the Metasploit folks and the Rise folks got together and finally got it working in OS X, which involves basically this little heap cookie. So you have to actually XOR your return address with a heap cookie to make it work properly in OS X. And there's this whole research paper about how it works, how to do it, how to avoid it. But the XOR value of that cookie has to be a valid instruction for your target platform. So you have to jump through all these stupid hoops to make the thing work right. Finally got it. There's a whole paper at risesecurity.org that talks about how to do it. And we released it. Then Symantec contacts the press again and says, oh no, now there's an exploit out for it from Metasploit. It's exactly the same as our code. I'm like, what do you mean exactly the same as your code? So finally, the Rise guys just emailed Symantec and said, dude, what the hell are you talking about? We spent like a month working on this technique. How do we mean exactly like your code? So after, I've got the emails here if anyone wants to call me out, and I'll show them on the screen. So Symantec guy comes back, and basically a couple emails go back and forth saying, well, how did you get around this technique? How did you get around this problem? It's not going to be reliable if you do that way. And finally comes out, well, I didn't really have much time to dig into it. Sorry. So bullshit, Symantec. Anyways. Oh, and it's finally patched yesterday. So.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to talk about now is NFS services. This is kind of old school too. I like a lot of the old techniques because they still work, especially on large networks. NFS is really your friend. If you find a system, a network that's running NFS widespread, especially if they're also running NIS, you're going to get very far. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. Like I've seen people scan specifically for NFS-related ports. You can use the show command in Linux or other Unixes to see what's mounted, what's exported, who's mounting. And it's important to do this sort of reconnaissance because the goal here is, okay, how do I hop, once I'm inside a network on some system, I have a foothold, how do I get to those next systems? How do I compromise more clients? And NFS is a good way to do this without using exploits. You're just going to use weird configurations in the network to jump from host to host. A really important target is NFS exported home directories. Servers that have these, if they're exported incorrectly, or if you have the right access, you can really leverage this to get farther in the network. If you get control of an NFS home directory, more than likely you're going to be able to easily own every node that mounts the NFS server. If you get root on an NFS server, you can become anyone who has a home directory on that server, either if they're running NIS or through SU. Some of the good things to do here are harvest known host files. So everybody has a .ssh directory. In there is a file that tracks every host that they connect to using SSH. So harvest that information. This will give you more targets to go after. It also tells you, there's a piece of information that tells you, these are hosts that trust this user. So this user has some kind of access. So even though you currently don't have access, you don't have an exploit, let's say all these hosts are patched, you can become that user and use the fact that he's trusted to get into more hosts. I think in newer versions of SSH they're starting to obfuscate this, but for most of the systems I see this is valid. A huge thing to harvest is allowed keys. OS X allows SSH keys by default, or at least it did on the last versions I tested, and they don't have to have passwords. So if people use SSH keys, steal their key, you use it to hop into more hosts, or generate your own key, and we'll go into that in a minute.
Actually, if I can interrupt real quick.
Yeah, sure.
It works. It works, damn it. So ended up what happened is when I reverted it, I forgot to set a password for my XP user account. So what happens with XP is you can't authenticate to a network account if no password is set for it. So I'm a moron, and part of my revert is actually have to go set a password for the account.
You want me to switch to your...
Yeah, let me flip back real quick. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but finally got this damn thing going. Hopefully it'll flip back. Yay, okay. So here's a little HTML script, just a little web page. This could actually be somewhere on the internet for all it mattered. It doesn't really matter too much. All right, I'm going to hurry through this real quick so Val can get to this stuff. Anyways, UNC URL. Over here we spawn off, let's see, where is it? The big fancy Metasploit command line spawns off a SOC server, spawns off an SMB server, sets our shell. Basically says, give me a reverse connect shell whenever someone connects to SMB. So we run this sucker, and there we go. All running happy. Now we go back over here in our web browser. We disabled auto connect because I don't have DNS set up, so that's why it's failing. But let's say we're just a random evil web host. We put a cookie on a page or redirect it via JavaScript, whatever you want to do. They go to test.html. So you can see it's kind of loading in the background. It's being really slow. While this is happening, it's actually negotiating the SMB with my server, and my server is proceeding to own the shit out of it. So now we can see that it actually works. First thing is the unauthenticated access. So it tries to log in without a password. We say, no, buddy, you got to give us a password if you want access to these resources. And now we say, hey, we got a password. Now we have the LANman hash, the NTLM hash, and then we authenticate back to the real host with it. And we say authenticating as VM WinXP developer. We authenticated, we connect to the admin $shell, generate the payload, we create a new executable file, we upload it to the website, we contact the service control manager, we get a handle to it, create a new service, close the service handle, open the service, finally print a little information about what we need to manually clean up, and then we start the damn service, which finally starts up a command shell here. So, whole way too much code to write to make this happen. And here we see it keeps trying to authenticate over and over again, but Metasploit's smart enough to say, well, we're ignoring it because we already owned it. So we do sessions-l, sessions-i, 1, C drive, boom. Now we are on this user. So C drive, let's see, document, C developer is my user account, and echo pwned hello.txt. And we can use any other Metasploit payload, they all work fine. So we go back to our desktop over here, and we'll refresh. Did I put in the wrong directory?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm stupid, sorry. One of these will go right. All right, here we go. So, hello.txt, phone. Anyway, so it does work, damn it. Usually works much more smoother, but sorry. Knowing's half the battle. All right, thanks, Ralph.
Sure. Okay. It looks like the slides are a little bit offset, but that's okay. I'll
You
talk
can
through
do it on
it.
this side if you like. Or yours are...
Yeah, I think there's a projector issue, but that's okay. So one thing to look at is a lot of large sites have software distribution servers. They don't want to go out and touch every machine, so that they will distribute the software through a centralized host. These are really good because it's sort of like a single point of failure to own all the clients in the network. One example that I've seen is a system set up where they have a big Solaris server that's serving out, GNU software, commercial software, whatever. All the nodes access this over NFS. In this case, we actually own the software distribution server and Trojaned like LS or GCC or whatever GNU tool they were exporting, and then waited for the shells to come in. We didn't really need any exploits to do that. We just used the fact that everybody trusted the software server and leveraged that. Trust is a really powerful thing on pen tests.
Try flipping here if you want to try this one.
We're going to do some musical chairs with the computers here.
Oh, same thing looks like.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, in this one example, all the nodes on the network were patched to the standard exploits that we had available to us. But we noticed that everybody was connecting to this NFS server. We showed what was exported, and it was like /software, different mounts like that. We managed to get in the server leveraging a trust hijacking issue that I'll talk about in a minute. And then we Trojan the binaries, and we got thousands of nodes sending us shells. So about trust relationships, the target you want may be unavailable to you directly, but not necessarily to another host you can reach. So expand your scope, upstream servers, DNS servers by a third party, all kinds of ideas. Just look beyond the direct target you're going for. I've worked with other companies that do pen tests, and a lot of times they will simply attack an IP address, and if they don't get anything, they give up. You got to attack the lateral addresses. And also networks. They may not trust everyone, but they'll trust each other. TCP wrappers, firewalls, they often have trust. So look for a node that's accepted by your target and own that as a foothold towards your real target. One thing I see a lot is people will have networks where they have both Unix and Windows, and they'll put TCP wrappers or firewall on all the Unix machines, but nothing on Windows. And so if you've got a vulnerable Windows box you can own, that's now an approved IP address on the Unix side. Hack the Windows box, put a port forward in, get past wrappers. In one example, I was targeting a Solaris home directory server because I wanted to get access to everybody's directories. It had TCP wrappers. I couldn't SSH to it. I couldn't get to it, but there's a bunch of Windows boxes on the same network. One of these Windows boxes had like a DCOM or a LSAS vulnerability. So got on the Windows box, dropped in a port forward to port 22, back to the home directory server, SSH to the Windows box. It sent me over to the home directory server, and I had access. You know, a lot of times, like, you'll hack the Windows box, you'll get the admin password, crack it with rainbow tables, and find out it's the same password as root on all the Unix boxes. So think about those trusts. Before I go into this next section, I want to thank, there's a guy, KRB Klepto, that helped with a lot of these pieces, so give him some credit. We're going to talk about hijacking SSH to leverage trust into other hosts from the one that you've owned. The idea behind this is to abuse legitimate users' access to other hosts over SSH. So if you've owned a box and the user on that box has access, why can't you? Even if you don't know the user's password, there's things you can do. Let's say they use one-time passwords, token cards, or whatever. That's no problem. You can get around that. There's a lot of available tools for this kind of stuff. A guy talked last year, I think MetalStorm. There's Trojan SSH clients. But there's some cool stuff that is built legitimately into SSH, which means you don't have to insert anything that would look malicious. There's also like TTY hijacking. So if somebody's SSH'd in, you don't have their password, hijack their console. When consoles crash all the time, most people don't suspect when their console freezes up. So I'm going to switch back over to this computer and show a short movie.
Hello, my name is David Maynor, and we're going to talk about wireless. Sorry. No offense to Maynor, it's just a funny comment.
Okay, 1 second here. Actually, I want to do full screen. These are kind of time-sensitive movies. Okay, so the background of this, we're on a machine. The machine happens to be called KDC, but that's irrelevant. We have access to a user account named Bob, and we want to leverage his access to other machines. So the idea behind this is we're going to wait for him to SSH to another host that we want to get into. There's a thing in SSH called master mode, which lets you reuse sockets that are already in existence. This is the command. It's ssh-m-s is this, and then you give it the name of the socket you want to use. You can name it whatever you want, and then the host you want to go to. So the idea behind this is that if you've owned this user's account, you can alias SSH to run this way. You can edit the SSH config to run this way. You can actually edit, if you get root on the box, you can edit the SSH config globally for all users to automatically do this master mode. And it'll make sense here in a second. Okay, so the user logs into host 2. We want to access host 2. So we're going to hijack the socket that he's already set up and log in. We don't know his password. We have no idea what it is. But we want to get into host 2, so we're going to use SSH master mode to do that. So we SU to the user. We run SSH. We reuse the socket that's already there. And we log in. It didn't even ask us for a password. So this is a way to jump from host to host without knowing passwords, hijacking users' trusts and their accounts. So 1 second here. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
If that was like an alias SSH, like with that command for the same socket, would it overwrite that socket again if you did the SSH command?
There's actually a way to write the command so that it randomizes the socket name each time. It'll be in the slides eventually, but it's like you do %r at, you can just make up some name and it'll randomize it. That way, you can hijack a whole bunch of people's machines. You could script all this so that you could, every time somebody SSHs anywhere, you hop on their socket, get on the next box. The next thing we like to attack is something called Kerberos, which is used for like one-time authentication. You get generated a ticket so you can hop from machine to machine. This is really great, especially for hackers. The idea here is you have a foothold on the network, you've compromised a box's root, but you don't have ways into all the other boxes. They're patched, whatever. So you're going to leverage Kerberos to get in, gain access to other trusted nodes. And I really like movies, so I'm going to show another one. Okay. Okay, so in this case, we have root on a machine. We're going to run the command called klist, which shows we don't have any credentials, we don't have any tickets, we can't go anywhere. We're going to become a user named Bob. I like to abuse Bob. We're going to show that, okay, we don't have any credentials as him either. Right now, we're not able to log into other hosts over Kerberos. For example, host 2 is the host that we want to break into. We don't know his password. We try. There's no Kerberos ticket. We're out of luck. We get permission denied. So we're going to take a look and see if Bob has any Kerberos tickets on the system. Kerberos tickets get left in the temp directory, and they start with KRB something something. So this weird-looking file name here, that's Bob's Kerberos ticket. You can see it's owned by Bob. You can see, basically what it's called. We're going to copy that file, change the name slightly here, and now we're going to do a klist, and we basically hijacked his ticket. So now anywhere he can go using his Kerberos credentials, we can go. And you'll see here we're going to try to log into host 2, and it didn't ask us for a password, we got in. So leveraging Kerberos, if you've got a foothold, you can hop into all kinds of hosts on the network. And I think we're getting close to the end here.
So that's even if that ticket's expired, you can still use it?
You can put in there's a command in Kerberos to regenerate the ticket so it doesn't expire. It depends on the configuration of the Kerberos server, but wait for him to generate another ticket and hijack it. The question was, can a user circumvent that by killing the ticket itself? And the answer is yes. If the user does a K-destroy, then you won't be able to hijack the ticket. But you could try copying the file off and accessing it later, and if it hasn't expired yet, it'll still be valid. So one thing you'd want to do is go through the temp directory and suck down all the temp files that you can. So...
hey, we've got 4 more minutes. 4 more minutes.
Yeah.
You can wait.
Okay, well, since we're so short on time, I'm going to go ahead and turn over here to the conclusion.
Okay. Can you flip the... Oh, you got it here. All right. So if you want to see more of the demos for Kerberos and all that sort of stuff, Val's actually got a bunch of other demos, and we've got a lot more stuff to talk about. And if you want to see that, come to our DEF CON talk on Friday. So Friday at 4, we'll be there doing this again, and hopefully with smoother demos and more time for Val. So apologize for taking some of his demo time. So,
Thanks for listening.
Sorry? Thanks.